David, welcome. And we're going to be talking about energy here, your field. Energy security is a buzzword now, and I would like to talk about energy security and European energy affairs in Europe in simple terms, so it could be easily understood. And I would like to start with the latest news. The European Union on Wednesday unveiled an antitrust case against Russian energy giant Gazprom. What do you think the implications for the company are going to be?
First of all, this was a case that was long overdue. This is an investigation that dates back about almost 3 years ago, where the down raids on various Gazprom offices in the 8 concerned member states, primarily in Central and Eastern Europe, took place. And then for various reasons, partly because these investigations take a long time, partly because I think there was a bit of a nervousness on behalf of the European Union, whether on top of all the political issues and disagreements we have Russia these days, this is something that should further add to the controversies. But then finally the European Commission moved and presented what is called a statement of objections that is going to be the first salvo in a likely very protracted legal battle between Gazprom and the European Commission. Now, as far as the implications are concerned, these are potentially very grave to Gazprom. First of all, they will have to fundamentally alter the business model upon which they have been operating on in the past decades in the European market. And they will have to comply with all the regulations and rules of the European Union, including the third energy package that stipulates the unbundling of transmission and production resources, and also with regard to third-party access, and very importantly with regard to rules and regulations on unfair pricing and rules and regulations on creating a single European energy market and disallowing suppliers like Gazprom to differentiate between various countries and various companies in the European market. In other words, the ban on re-export will likely be deemed as against European regulations. So Gazprom cannot stipulate in its contracts that a gas supply into one country cannot be re-exported to another country. So it will fundamentally change the business model upon which Gazprom has been operating on. It has the potential to break the monopolistic position of Gazprom in various Central and Eastern European markets. And also, depending on how Gazprom conducts itself and how it reacts to this whole procedure, it actually has the potential to exert the fundamental financial pressure, further financial pressure, I have to add, on Gazprom, in as much as they might end up having to pay quite hefty fines to the European Commission and also remedies for various European companies and the consumers.
And what scenarios do you expect, what modes of behavior do you expect from?
It's hard to tell. I think the sensible approach and the sensible attitude on behalf of Gazprom would be to settle. Because the way these investigations and the way these procedures work is that after the statement of objections, there will be a prolonged period of sort of informal discussions between Gazprom and the European Commission. And if Gazprom is smart enough, and if the leadership is smart enough, and if the political pressure coming from the Kremlin will not be that strong, which I expect to be very, very strong, then it would be a lot easier and potentially a lot cheaper for Gazprom to settle, meaning that they will have to abandon all the practices that the European Commission objected to. They will have to comply with all the regulations and rules of the European Union, and they will have to change their business model in terms of not discriminating between these various countries and various markets on the European level. Now, if they don't settle, then what will happen is that eventually the European Commission will levy a hefty fine, and then Gazprom, of course, can object that and turn to the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. But in all likelihood, at the end of a protracted legal battle, it can take years, probably they will lose that lawsuit, and then they will have to spend a lot more money on not just the fines, but also on all the various legal remedies. And Gazprom can be then sued by various companies not just the European Commission, but various companies and then various consumer groups. So potentially they will stack up billions of dollars of various legal fines and legal lawsuits they're going to have to end up paying.
In other words, it does seem to be serious. I just talking to the importance of this case. The New York Times just recently suggested that any changes to Gazprom practices will be a challenge, and I'm quoting here, the key pillar to Putin's economic and geopolitical strategy. Would you agree with that?
I fully agree. Gazprom is already under tremendous financial pressure. And not just Gazprom, but the whole Russian state and the Russian budget, which heavily relies on hydrocarbon resources and revenue stemming from, mostly from oil flows. Actually, the oil flows and the oil revenues are way more important for the Russian state than the gas revenues. But when it comes to the geopolitical weapon issue, then gas issue, that the gas is a lot more easily be used for geopolitical pressure for reasons that are quite complex, and I'm happy to go into later. But Gazprom is already under tremendous pressure, financial pressure, partly because of the collapse of oil prices, and since still the majority of the Gazprom contracts in Europe are pegged to oil prices, and it's an oil-indexed gas price. Because of that, because of the low oil prices, you end up having low gas prices as well. So that actually impacts Gazprom's bottom line quite heavily. You also have the sanctions, and that also weighs in very heavily when it comes to Gazprom's ability to access financing and access Western loans and Western banking system. So that's also a heavy burden on the Gazprom budget these days. And then you have the Eastern expansion plan, which actually makes tremendous sense from a Russian perspective. And it's a very logical next step to diversify the export markets and to concentrate more heavily on a dynamically growing Asian market. But in order to be able to do that, you actually need to invest very heavily in upstream and midstream resources in Eastern Siberia and all the linkages between Russia and China. And in order to do that, again, you need available finances. Again, Gazprom is in a very, very hard-pressed position to come up with all those billions of dollars you need to invest into Chayanda, Kovitka, all these Eastern Siberian fields in order to be able to supply the Chinese market and then the larger Asian markets. And then you have the LNG expansion plans, which also require a lot of capital. That's largely not Gazprom, although Gazprom is also involved, but it's also a bunch of other companies, including Novatek and Rosneft, but they also face the same problems, that because of the sanctions and because of the low oil price environment, they are really struggling to come up with the funding. And it ultimately comes back to haunt the Kremlin as well, because again, as they rely very heavily on all these revenues, this price environment and these legal and political pressures coming from both Europe and Asia at the same time will be very difficult to sustain in the medium and long term.
Speaking of Europe and Asia, if European market becomes less welcoming for Gazprom, will it be able at some point to successfully redirect the gas flow to China? You started talking about this, finances, but as a prospective market, will China be a hope for Gazprom?
I think it's an empty threat, to be honest. The Asian markets are very, very promising, and they are very fast growing, but it's not going to work in a way that you will redirect resources from the European market to the Asian market. Russia, actually, the leadership has been trying to promote the Western Siberian fields when it comes to selling gas to China. The Chinese, very consciously and very smartly, in my opinion, pushed back against all those attempts because they knew full well that the Russian playbook in this case was to try to arbitrage between Europe and Asia, and that's not in the interest of China, it's not in the interest of the EU, so they pushed back very heavily against the so-called Western route, and they put enormous pressure on Russia to acquiesce to supplying China mainly from the eastern part of Siberia, which also makes a lot more commercial sense because it's closer to the main consumption centers in the eastern seaboard of China. So to bring that gas all the way from Western Siberia to the eastern seaboard of China would have been a huge waste of resources in many ways in terms of midstream investment. So I expect that there will be large-scale upstream and midstream development again, if Gazprom can afford it, or if they don't, whether there will be a political decision made in Moscow to allow more Chinese upstream investment into Russian energy infrastructure, which is a big if at this point, and this has not been the Russian practice so far. And there was a lot of pushback against allowing upstream investment coming into Russia, not just from China, but also from Europe, in most of the cases. So if they allow more Chinese investment coming in, then these projects will be probably more realistic in the medium term. But again, if you look at the time frame, and also if you look at the quantities, so Russia supplies about 140 to 60 BCM, depends on which year we are talking about and how mild the winter is in Europe, to Europe. And that's excluding the former Soviet space. So that quantity will not be matched anytime soon by the demand in the Asian markets. Again, these are fast-growing markets, but China actually diversified quite extensively its own natural gas imports in the past, and they are importing already large quantities, around 40 BCM from Turkmenistan. They will import more from Turkmenistan, also from Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. They are importing gas from Myanmar. They will be tapping into the newly online Australian LNG projects. They have access to Middle Eastern, Qatari and other resources in the form of LNG. And then down the line, within 5 years or so, they will also have access to American and also Canadian LNG, liquefied natural gas. So they are pretty well supplied, and then China also has some potential to develop its own shale gas resources, although so far the news have been quite disappointing. But we will see how that goes in the medium term. I would not be surprised to expect a bit more coming online in the next 10 years or so from China as well. So, and then the third issue that is critically important is the price environment. So you won't be able to have the same price in Asia as you have in Europe. And this was part of the main piece of contention between China and Russia, part of the reason why these negotiations have been going on for almost 10 years now. And in principle, they made an arrangement, a final arrangement at the end of last year, but I'm quite skeptical whether this is indeed the final arrangement. And then it's hard to know what the eventual price agreement was, but according to all the indications I received, the price the Russians ended up acquiescing to is going to be a lot lower than they wanted to have from the Chinese eventually. It's going to be a lot lower price than what they receive on most of the European markets these days. So all in all, I don't expect the Asian market to be able to fully replace the European markets anytime soon, not in the next 15 years. I don't think it's a realistic assumption. The European market will remain, from a gas perspective, the primary market for Russian gas for the next 10 years for sure, and maybe even beyond that. And the quantities, because of the difficulty in the upstream environment, because of the enormous expenditures in the midstream environment, and because of all these pricing and political issues, I don't expect that to even be half of what Russia exports to Europe these days.
Well, politics is heavily involved, obviously, in all this decision making. And I want to ask my last question about Gazprom and then move to LNG, US LNG that you already mentioned. So Russia has plans to stop delivering gas through Ukraine by 2019. As I understand. And this gas will be sent through the Turkish stream. How do you think it's going to play out in the current geopolitical environment?
First of all, again, I don't think it's realistic. I'd be surprised to see that happen. I don't think by 2019 you can totally relinquish the Ukrainian transit route. I understand the Russian sensitivities, and I actually agree with the assessment, for better or for worse, that the Ukrainian political and security crisis and the war in Ukraine and Russia's involvement in Ukraine won't be resolved by 2019, unfortunately. I expect a protracted conflict, even if it's a frozen conflict. So this issue will remain on the table, and it will remain a main transit risk for both the European suppliers and for Russia. So, but at the same time, when it comes to Turkish Stream, it's not that easy that you just build a 63 BCM pipeline and then the European suppliers who have been supplied so far through the Ukrainian transit route will then go down to the Balkans and pick up that gas at the Turkish-Greek border. First of all, Russia is contractually obligated to provide that gas at a given delivery point, and then delivery point is usually somewhere along the Ukrainian Slovak main route. They have been supplying Europe so far. So to change that unilaterally and to say that from now on I'm going to supply your gas at a different delivery point is going to be a big legal issue. So if Gazprom indeed does that, and if Russia indeed does that, then they can very quickly find themselves in front of all kinds of legal and courts and arbitrations in Europe. So that's first of all not that easy from a legal perspective to change the delivery point, because they are by these long-term natural gas supply treaties, they are contractually obligated to deliver the gas at a certain point. Second, I still think that the Turkish Stream undertaking, although I expect the first two lines amounting to about half of the capacity, 32 BCM, that will be built, because a large part of that infrastructure is already in place. The ship is in place. The pipes have been purchased. So the marginal cost of completing the initial two lines will be quite low. So I expect that to happen. But then what's going to happen in my mind is that half of their capacity will be used to supply the Turkish market, and it will essentially replace that 16 BCM pipeline that goes down through Ukraine, Bulgaria, or Romania, Bulgaria, and then down to Turkey. That is the so-called Western route, and through which part of the gas supplies to Turkey were supplied so far. So that's not really new gas. That's going to be replacing the existing supplies that went to Turkey. There will be some gas supply or gas demand growth on the Turkish market. So some of the gas will end up filling up for that. And then you have the potential to supply the Balkans, which has a lower demand up to now. And then you actually also have, that's quite an interesting prospect, to feed some of that gas into TAP, which is the Trans-Adriatic pipeline, and then bring it to Italy, and through that the Western European market. So it goes back to the first question: if Gazprom is successful in renegotiating the contracts, then that's not a completely far-fetched idea to replace some of the gas that goes through Ukraine. So I'm not saying that there will be no gas replaced through the transit. I'm just saying that it's going to be very, very difficult to completely circumvent the Ukrainian transit route. And the reason for that is that the second two lines are somewhat more difficult, also somewhat more expensive actually to build. So to put those in place and to completely circumvent the Ukrainian gas transit route is going to be difficult, partly because I expect a lot of European pushback out of solidarity with Ukraine, but also trying to deny Russia's ability to pressure Europe into completely circumvent Ukraine. On the other hand, there is a lot of nervousness and jitteriness in Europe about the Ukrainian transit route as well. So I'm not saying that I would completely exclude the possibility of down the line, beyond 2020, I think more realistically, that the Ukrainian transit route will be dried up completely, either through a partial Turkish stream, or even more so, actually, it probably makes more sense from a commercial perspective, through the expansion of Nord Stream. That is now a 55 BCM capacity pipeline. It's not fully used, but it can be further expanded. Probably the incremental cost of that would be lower than to build the second two lines of South Stream or Turkish Stream. So I would not be surprised to see that debate re-emerging and to see that conversation restarting about the expansion of Nord Stream sometime soon.
One more project that has been in the news recently is the South Stream, obviously. And there are opinions that the fact that it was cancelled by Russia means this first victory for signifying this European unity in terms of providing energy security. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. That was a major victory, actually. For a long time, Russia did not believe in Europe's seriousness when it came to these energy security issues and Europe's ability to really be unified on these issues. And they, I think, have not realized that Europe has come a long way ever since the 2006 and then the 2009 crises and the gas cutoffs and the disputes between Russia and Ukraine. And they actually put in place a legal framework that also enabled the lawsuit against Gazprom, although that's also partly based on competition law and competition, the competition authority of the European Union, but also partly on the third energy package. They adopted the third energy package in 2009. They adopted this national gas supply security framework in 2011. So all these legal and political tools are now in place to unify the member states. The EU is still not there. We are still not completely united. There are still various outlooks on how to treat Russia, how to manage the EU-Russian energy relationship as a whole, how to go about the single European energy market, what the energy union should constitute of, and there are still many disputes, and I don't expect a truly unified European energy policy anytime soon. That's not what we are talking about. But in terms of dealing with Russia, to a large extent, this is a lot more unified position than it used to be. And there was indeed a victory that by really being consistent in asking Russia and Gazprom to comply with European regulations and not granting any exemption under the rules, they essentially made Gazprom realize, to put it very simply, that if they end up building South Stream, and then South Stream will have to comply with European regulations, then it's going to be an extremely detrimental proposition for Russia, because if you think about it, then you have a dedicated pipeline, a large capacity pipeline that goes through Bulgaria all the way up to the main markets in Central Europe, that will then be used or can be used by other suppliers because of the third-party access legislation and because of the rules that you actually have to allow for 50% of the capacity to be used by other suppliers. So in other words, if Russia went ahead and built South Stream in its original form, then Russia would have built Nabucco for the European Union, a dedicated large capacity pipeline that goes from essentially Bulgaria, that would have been very easy to link up with the Southern Gas Corridor and link up with other resources coming from Azerbaijan and other places. So I think that was a realization that the EU is really serious in making Gazprom comply with those regulations. And if they end up building a large piece of hardware that then can be used by other suppliers, that's a it's a risky proposition for the Russian supplier.
And in terms of the aftermath for the cancellation of the South Stream, Bulgaria seemed to have recovered very quickly, and just the other day there was an announcement that in Sofia an agreement was signed to build a pipeline between Bulgaria, Romania and Greece. Do you think it's a sign of how easy it's going to be for the countries that are currently dependent on the Russian supplies of energy to just break free and to come up with some alternatives?
It does signal that, actually. I mean, to a large extent, to be very self-critical here, these vulnerabilities we have been living as Central and Eastern European countries for such a long time have been, to a large extent, self-inflicted wounds. We could have diversified, we could have built up these interconnectors way earlier. We could have, and of course there is a larger European context to that, and of course we need all the support the European Union could lend us. Of course there are political issues involved, of course there are a lot of vulnerabilities and sensitivities involved, but we have within our reach, especially if we come together as a region, and especially if the European Union and the United States actually forcefully supports these interconnectors and these projects, which they do these days, although of course more financial support would always be very welcome, but we understand that in the current environment this is difficult. But these are relatively easy projects to pull off. The interconnector between Greece and Bulgaria has been on the table for years, and for reasons that is sort of beyond understanding in many ways, and it's hard to really comprehend that against all the national security and national interests in Bulgaria and all in Greece, why this did not happen, and I can only speculate why this did not happen for such a long time. But I think there is a realization in many of these countries, including in Bulgaria, fortunately, that this is critically important for the security and energy supply security for the country. And then the implementation of these projects will finally proceed. Again, these are relatively easy, technically easy and relatively cheap projects to pull off. They already secured European funding, so it will be fairly easy and fairly quick to put them in place. And then these countries are in a dramatically different situation to face Russia and Gazprom as a supplier in the future. I mean, the prime example is what happened in Lithuania, and I think it's a great example in many ways, that as soon as they managed to build up that LNG terminal that is now in Lithuania, which is a floating regasification terminal that is able to receive supplies, Gazprom immediately offered about a 20% discount for Lithuania. So I always say this, but the name of the game is not completely diversifying away from Russia. That would be a stupid thing. We have the world largest energy and natural gas importer region, that is the European Union, and then we have the world largest, or the second largest now, natural gas producer, Russia, next to each other. Russia still produces way cheaper than many of the other suppliers that the European Union has. So it would be stupid not to sustain this relationship on a commercial basis, but the important thing is to place it on a commercial trade basis and not on a political basis. And to have a commercial relationship that is based on fair terms, that is based on a non-monopolistic position of the supplier, and that is based on transparency and fair pricing, and based on a relationship that cannot be exploited to put political pressure on various different member states. But as a lucrative commercial relationship, I am all for sustaining an EU-Russian relationship, even if the larger political context of the EU-Russian relationship is a very problematic one and will remain so for the foreseeable future.
You mentioned LNG, and I would like to talk about the LNG revolution, what they call in the United States. And testifying in Congress recently, you said the growth of natural gas production in the United States in the past decade has been nothing short of spectacular. Do you feel that this spectacular somehow will benefit the EU, or not even somehow, to a big extent? How do you expect this relationship is going to be unfolding?
Sure. And first of all, as I emphasized in my testimony, there is a big debate here in the US, rightly so, about oil and gas exports. For historical reasons, I don't want to necessarily go into, there is a very restrictive trade regime when it comes to oil and gas exports. That partly stems back to the early 1920s and 30s when it comes to gas, and partly stems back to the 1970s, to the oil embargo era after the Yom Kippur War. But it's a highly anachronistic environment, and I found it peculiar that the United States, that usually rightly so stands for free trade and no resource nationalism, when it comes to oil and gas, practices unfortunately a somewhat different policy. So it would be high time to change the policy on both ends, both on restricting natural gas exports and both on crude oil exports in that case. Now on natural gas there is a lot of movement, and I've been pleased to see that in the past 2 years or so, even though the legal environment is still restrictive in principle, but in practice, when it comes to the authorization of these various LNG projects that need a license from both the Department of Energy and FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, actually went ahead quite expeditiously. So the licensing procedure that was a bottleneck for quite some time actually speeded up in the past 2 years or so. And then there are already, I think, 7 projects that received authorization from both DOE and FERC. In other words, they will be able to proceed if indeed there will be a final investment decision to build all these projects, and if indeed they will start exporting in the next 5-6 years or so, which I'm actually very optimistic that they will, or most of these projects will, then we are already talking about 100 BCM of gas coming out from the United States for exports beyond 2020. So it will take some time to ramp these up. The first supplies actually will become available early next year. There will be the Cheniere project in the Sabine Pass down in Louisiana. And then all the other projects, Corpus Christi and a couple of others, will come online in the next 5, 6, 7 years. And then there are more in the queue, so I could easily imagine that in addition to this 100 BCM of gas, there will even be more. Some talk about 150, some even talk about 200. The domestic production capabilities of the US can easily sustain that, because all the prognoses say that the current production will further increase from the current 700 something BCM, well above 1000 BCM even. So the production capacities within the US are there in all likelihood, and that's what all the analysis show. They will not have a major impact on domestic prices. So the US will continue to enjoy a low price, raw natural gas price environment, even if there will be unlimited exports. So many of these projects are built on the Gulf Coast. Some of these will be on the eastern seaboard of the United States, and then some eventually will be on the western seaboard. And there are all kinds of intricate and difficult logistical and transportation issues involved, including issues about the expansion of the Panama Canal that could affect the calculation of various commercial players. But in all likelihood, and if the Cheniere contracts are any indication, a significant chunk of that gas will end up in Europe. Or it's at least some gas will end up in Europe. And even if a large chunk of the gas will end up in Asia, because the prices might be higher there when it comes to LNG, although that's actually anybody's guess how the prices will move, because 2 years ago the prices in Asia were way higher than today, partly because of the Fukushima nuclear closures in Japan. Now the price difference between Europe and Asia is not that significant anymore. And since the transportation costs are somewhat cheaper, especially from the Gulf and then the eastern seaboard of the US to bring gas to Europe, I would not be surprised to see large quantities of gas ending up in Europe. But even if they don't, and that's something I emphasized in front of Senate as well, even if they don't, even if the large chunk of that gas will end up in Asia, because of the increasingly global nature of the LNG market and the gas markets, and the increasing interconnectedness of all these previously very separated and isolated natural gas markets, the added liquidity on the global LNG market that can then trickle into the European market will have a downward effect on European prices. And this is indeed something we have already seen when it came to Gazprom's renegotiations with regard to its various long-term natural gas treaties and supply treaties with big companies in Western Europe in the past couple of years. And part of the reason why that happened is that since the US became a major, it was supposed to become a major importer, but eventually it ended up not requiring any imports because of all the domestic production increase. So all those LNG supplies that were destined to go to the US market from Qatar, from Algeria, from other places, ended up in the European market. And then that put a very effective downward pressure on the prices in Western Europe, especially on those very liquid hubs that were able to get LNG supplies. So because the additional liquidity on the market in Western Europe, and because of the more competitive environment and additional supplies, Gazprom already found itself in a situation that they were compelled to renegotiate. They were compelled to react to the different market environment.
So in terms of energy security in general in Europe and energy security for Ukraine, there are a lot of arguments that the US LNG can help a lot to support Ukrainian sovereignty and to somehow improve the situation. Do you think it's going to be happening short term or more long term in terms of supporting this general concept of European security?
Now, this is important. So this is not a silver bullet, and very often it was portrayed as such, and that's a mistake. It will not provide a short-term solution for neither Ukraine nor to Europe if there is an immediate cutoff from Russia, let's say the next winter. So this is not the silver bullet solution that if only the United States opened up an unrestricted export to the European Union, then overnight we will have all that US LNG coming in. That's not so simple. It's more a medium-term story. It's more about, again, increasing liquidity and contributing to a more liquid and more competitive global natural gas market in Europe and also in Asia. Actually, that's also critically important in Asia, to provide additional liquidity to the Asian markets and to make sure that that's also a competitive environment, and to prevent all those gas wars in Asia happening, and to learn from the European mistakes in many ways, I think, from that end. So it's not a short-term thing. It won't happen overnight. There will be only smaller quantities coming online. Whether some of those will make it to Ukraine, difficult to tell. Some of those actually might through the reverse flow from either Slovakia or Poland at some point, or even Hungary at some point. I'm less optimistic about LNG supplies directly to Ukraine because of the Bosporus issue, and because it's going to be very, very difficult in this current environment to actually build up an LNG terminal on the Ukrainian coastline, partly because of security issues, but partly because of Turkish resistance against letting LNG tankers through the Bosporus, which you can argue whether it's from a legal standpoint is the right position or not, but nevertheless there is a very strong political objection from the Turkish side for various reasons. But even, again, this is a long-term story. This is a strategic argument in favor of US LNG exports that, first of all, I think it's a principal issue, as I emphasized, that the US should practice what it preaches in terms of free flow of goods and free flow of resources. And I think it's critically important to uphold the good example and to convey that message that the energy resources should be traded on open, transparent, and unrestricted markets globally. And I think it's critically important in Asia, in Africa, in all these places, to send that signal and then send that message. And then second, to directly or indirectly prop up the potential additional supplies to Europe, so that they have a diversified European natural gas market they will be able to use down the line.
What kind of energy forecast can you give for Ukraine, short term and medium term?
I think Ukraine is in a great position to be, if it wants, be completely self-sufficient in terms of gas. Self-sufficient meaning that it only relies on itself and then supplies from Europe. So in other words, they are in a position that within 5 years they will be able to, maybe even sooner, they will be able to completely cut off imports from Russia. There are many reasons for that. There are still huge efficiency gains to be won in Ukraine. The current gas consumption is still way high. It could be cut back down further by reforming the subsidy regime, by increasing prices. Is actually socially very sensitive and very painful in many ways.
But it's inevitable, yes.
But it's inevitable in many ways, and by what we actually advocated in one of the Atlantic Council reports, a very targeted subsidy regime that actually at the same time promotes efficiency and also helps the poor and those straight out of the society that could otherwise be very seriously hurt by a sudden increase in natural gas prices. And that would be critically important. We understand the social sensitivities behind that. But on the other hand, the problem with the subsidy regime so far is that it not only helped those who are in need, but largely actually helped those who are not in need at all. And it sustained an industrial subsidy regime that was way beyond the means of a state like Ukraine, and it ended up costing several percentage of the GDP, which is a huge luxury to have, ended up subsidizing industries and oligarchs that were not in need of that subsidy at all. So it was a highly, not to mention the corruption part of the system, that it's actually up to today entirely unclear how much gas Ukraine really consumes, because it's easily fathomable that up to 5 There are some people who even say that up to 6-7 BCM of the gas is not actually consumed. It's just a scheme that the gas is nominally entering Ukrainian territory, and then the Ukrainians pay for that, and that amount of money, that gas is never delivered actually, but that money that is getting paid is distributed among both players, including in Ukraine and in Russia. So anyway, I don't want to speculate, but that's for sure that there is a huge amount of corruption involved. There's a huge amount of inefficiency involved. And then there is also, partly because of all these reasons, and partly because of a horrible regulatory political framework in Ukraine up to today, and even today, unfortunately, even with all the reforms, the domestic production has been suppressed for quite a long time. Ukraine also has enormous reserves, or at least large reserves, both on the conventional front and especially on the unconventional front, although the geology might be a bit trickier on the unconventional front, as the example of Chevron shows, and also Shell to some extent, that it might be trickier. But even on the conventional side and then offshore resources side, you have potential additional domestic indigenous gas resources in Ukraine that you can bring online, and then you can increase production within Ukraine and then decrease the reliance of Ukraine on Russian gas imports. And then adding extra capacities to the reverse flow, which is already being put in place from Slovakia, then you can practically take care of all the import needs of Ukraine coming from the European, the direction of the European Union. That actually might well be Russian gas, funnily enough, if you have a single market, and if you have, and that's part of the reason why this Gazprom investigation is so important, because if you end up doing away with all these restrictions on re-export, then even if it's Russian gas, enters into Germany and then proceeds towards the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and then actually can re-enter into Ukraine. All those molecules that originally came from Russia, but they will re-enter into Ukraine without actually Ukraine needing to be in a direct relationship with Russia on gas purchases. So it can easily, Naftogaz or whatever company will be in charge of that gas purchases, or companies will be in charge of that gas purchase, can enter into a contractual relationship with German suppliers or Czech suppliers or any other European company.
So you're talking about this great availability of resources in Ukraine itself. What will it take to start practically extracting those resources and putting them to work? Is it going to be money? Is it going to be money coming from the outside? Do these need to be resources from the inside, somehow redirected in the budget?
It's going to be difficult. First, you would need political stability. That is going to be difficult. You also need a regulatory regime, a tax regime, a competition regime in place that is conducive for investment. And we have seen some of these reforms coming through, and many of the legislation that have been adopted in the Rada in Kiev are very encouraging and very positive and point to the right direction. The key is the implementation, the key is the institutional setup, how these pieces of legislation will be implemented. Will they be implemented, or will they only, as unfortunately we have seen many times in the past, only be on paper, and then the actual reality being something completely different. But if they will be implemented, if they will be put in place, if there will be an independent institutional framework in place, including with an independent competition authority, including with a highly professional taxation authority, including taking very seriously all the anti-corruption measures and efforts, then that down the line can create enough confidence, even with the political issues and political crisis in place, perhaps in a frozen form, that there will be foreign investors coming into Ukraine and having the ability to invest into all these somewhat neglected fields in Ukraine. You also need a lot of technical expertise that the Ukrainian companies don't necessarily have. They also have a large and very rich tradition in exploiting some of these resources, but partly because of the political issues and partly because of the lack of access to all the modern technology and all the experience all these Western companies have to be able to be a lot more efficient in extracting all these, even the conventional resources. It is needed in order to increase production in Ukraine. And then you also have, which we very often completely neglect, but it's equally important, Ukraine has a tremendous potential in renewable energy. in wind in particular, but to some extent solar as well. But wind is a huge opportunity. But again, in order to see that happening, you need a stable, reliable legislative and regulatory framework in place that sends the right message to foreign investors that this is a place where laws and regulations don't change overnight and they are actually complied with, and there is a reliable judicial system that can enforce them. And that will take years, I'm afraid. So there will be a medium, at least if not long-term struggle. And since there is so much, how to put it nicely, a lack of confidence in Ukraine, unfortunately, for the past 25 years or so, and for all the repeatedly failed attempts to reform the country, it will require a lot of reliable implementation of all these legislations to regain that trust that was lost down the line.
European energy market and European energy situation seems to be very action heavy now. European Energy Union. Now you mentioned that we can't expect a lot in the next. We were talking 4 years till 2019 in terms of improvements in Ukraine. Let's take 2020. It's a big date because by 2020, the U.S. is supposed to become completely energy sufficient, self-sufficient. And if we're drawing the picture of 2020 in the European context, what do you expect to see there? Just to try and create this medium-term forecast.
I mean, first of all, the U.S. it's a relative term. What does that mean to be energy independent? Indeed, if you think about oil and gas import requirements, if you put the United States, Canada, and Mexico together, then indeed there is a realistic chance that these markets in and of themselves will be self-sufficient and will not require imports from outside. That actually doesn't mean that they won't import from the outside, because how the oil markets are structured, and there will be a lot of imports and there will be a lot of exports, and then products will be exported, and maybe perhaps hopefully crude oil will can be actually traded unhindered by then. So anyway, it's not so black and white that these countries will just trade with each other, and the global nature of the oil markets will in all likelihood remain. So there will be a lot of trading taking place. But yeah, indeed, there will be large producers that they will be able to, in principle, take care of their own domestic needs, especially if the Mexican energy sector reform really comes through and be implemented, and then those hopes will be realized that are attached to the Mexican energy sector these days. Europe is going to be in a dramatically different position for sure. How much so? That's a quick question. Europe is already about 65% dependent on gas imports and about 85% dependent on oil imports, and that those numbers by 2035 actually will go up to close to 90% each if the current trends continue. Now, there are many uncertainties in that equation. The first uncertainty is the gas market, actually, how gas markets will shape up. There were previously a lot more optimistic expectations in terms of gas demand growth on the European market that have proved to be unfunded, partly because of the crisis in 2008, 9, 10, lower economic activity that corresponds with lower natural gas demand, of course. So the European gas demand has been quite flat lately. Now, whether this is going to pick up is going to be a function of several different things. One is how this European Energy Union will shape up, and in particular how the so-called reform of the emission trading scheme, the ETS system, will look like in the EU. There is a lot of talk around that, and that might happen in the next 2 years or so. The current system is in principle a great system. In practice, it's overloaded with quotas, so it ends up being quite distortive in many ways, because you just don't have high enough carbon price within the system that actually incentivizes the greener and cleaner forms of energy. And in that respect, gas is a cleaner form if you compare it to coal, because it emits about half the CO2 not to mention the other dirty stuff coal emits when you burn it and generate electricity. So if you indeed end up reforming the ETS system in a way that actually generates more demand for gas, then that will increase the gas demand in Europe. And that will in all likelihood, because I don't really see the domestic production, including on the unconventional side of things in Europe, pick up anytime soon. The geology is difficult. There are many other issues, including political issues you have to face in the European market. So indigenous production within the EU is not going to increase. In all likelihood, it will decrease further in the North Sea and in the Netherlands as well, and in other traditional producer states that still produce to some extent. So you will need more imports, especially if the demand is higher. So there will be more need for Russian gas, there will be more need for gas from the Caspian, from the Middle East, from North Africa, from the Eastern Mediterranean, and then also from the US and various other LNG suppliers. And that's a liability and the vulnerability of Europe. But if you can indeed create a liquid and competitive and unified European gas market, but then I think that the risks can be managed because you have multiple suppliers. You can actually come up with a smart policy to balance the suppliers. The suppliers will be concerned not to cut off the gas to you because then there is another supplier that will step in. So if you do it that way, then it's a liability and it's a vulnerability, but it's manageable, I think, in many ways. On the oil side, it has been a largely global and liquid market so far, so I'm less concerned about that. The big question there is the Middle East. And then when the turmoil in the Middle East will spill over into places like Saudi Arabia, how will the Iran question be shaped? Whether the Middle East can be kept stable beyond 2020 and how stable that will be, and whether it can remain a major source of oil. That's going to be a major issue. And actually whether Europe and some Asian states, including China, of course, in particular, will probably at some point consider shouldering a larger share of the burden in policing the Middle East and how that will look like. That's a very, very interesting question because it has been largely the United States that played the policeman in the Middle East. But American policymakers increasingly, rightly, I think, point out that Europe actually imports a lot more oil from the Middle East and China also today than the United States does. So in many ways, it would be sensible to have a compensation around a more shared vision of security in the Middle Eastern space among all these major actors and importers. And then the fourth issue that is critically important, and that's why it's so difficult to actually make projections, is the role of technology and renewable energies in particular, but also what we usually call game-changing technologies or potentially game-changing technologies. What happens if there is a breakthrough in energy storage, for example, in battery storage technology, for example, that will almost overnight make renewable energies a lot more viable on a commercial lens. We have already seen a drastic reduction in costs when it comes to solar, but also onshore wind. Onshore wind installations cost a fraction of what they used to even 5 years ago. Last year, half of energy infrastructure investment went into renewable energies, and there is a major and fundamental shift underway on the global energy market. So if you extrapolate the current trends, then I would say that oil and gas will still be, of course, critically important in 2020. In all likelihood, they will be. But I would not exclude a sea change, an exponential acceleration of the spreading of renewables at some point. That's probably going to be beyond 2020. And it's really very hard to anticipate when the technological and other developments will come together in a perfect storm. But I would say that when we talk about the quantities and the export and the import dependence ratio in 2035, I think we're going to have a dramatically different conversation in the early 2020s or the mid 2020s because of all the potential technological changes and all the potential spread of renewables. That from a geopolitical perspective will mean that, from a European perspective, will mean that there will be a lot more self-sufficiency from Europe's perspective and a lot less reliance on outside suppliers of hydrocarbons, not to mention the climate change other aspects of that.
So good news. Thank you so much.
Potentially.
Thank you so much, David. And we'll be looking out for whatever predictions you made. And we hope to see you here again. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.